Test. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for coming to Liberty.js here. I'm really excited to speak. My topic is everyone needs standards. And you might think this is probably a pretty boring topic, and so I thank you for taking a chance to come here and listen to me speak. I know there's some pretty exciting React topics going on right now but I'll try to make this as entertaining as possible. So, because how exciting could JavaScript standards be, really? But first, hopefully this works. Great. I'm Dan Gautsch. I'm a senior UI developer at Think Brownstone. You can find me on Twitter at I am Dan in Philly. And shameless plug here, we are recruiting at Think Brownstone. Please, you can talk with TJ, who's over there in the nice t-shirt, about any open positions we have. So. We have two studios. Our headquarters is in Conshohocken, and we have an office here in Center City, Philadelphia. Cool. So I kind of want to set a groundwork here, a baseline for what are standards. And there's some key things I want to pull out here. I got two quotes. One is from the IE, and one simply from plain old Webster's dictionary. And the IE defines standards as from the fundamental building blocks for product development by establishing consistent protocols that can be yada yada. There's actually a couple key phrases I want to pull out from here. Standards really are establishing consistent protocols that are universally understood. And it's a little more concisely put with Webster's is a level of quality, achievement that is considered acceptable or desirable. So when we talk about this in context of JavaScript standards, it's really writing code in a way that is universally understood, speaks for itself, and doesn't take a lot of extra to understand. And there's more to it than that, but just kind of think of this in context as I go through the rest of the talk here. So I really feel there is a problem with the way everyone writes code, and it's not something you can fix. It's something you have to manage. And it really is, the problem is that we're all human, and you're going to make errors. So how do you fight your own humanity? And like I said, everyone has written bad code. I've certainly written bad code. I go back and I look at code I've written a year ago, sometimes 6 months ago or 2 years ago, and I'm like, what was I thinking? Why did I do that? And you're like, this probably was a beautiful piece of code. When I finished writing it, I was very happy with myself, and I smiled and nodded. And then a year later, I'm like, I have to maintain this code. And it's like, this is terrible. Why did I do it like this? And that's a problem, right? We don't want that because it creates churn. It causes extra hours on a project and ultimately could cost the business some money. And it really comes down to we all work under project deadlines. And I don't want to be an idealist here where I understand why bad code gets written. One, sometimes it's just ignorance and you write the code that way because that's the best way you know how to write it then and there. And other times it's who's ever been in a situation where there's a project deadline and it's 11th hour and yeah, we got a hand over here. Good. At least one person knows what I'm talking about. More hands, please. And you're like, well, we got this really quick fix, but it's a terrible implementation, or we can spend a week to do the right thing. And the business is like, quick fix, do it. And so that's sometimes you have to do that. And as long as you board up that code and you put warnings and flags and say, there be dragons here, sometimes it's okay, but it happens. So I did an exhaustive research on Google about trends on software quality. You can see this is my empirically reviewed study. So this goes back to 2004. I guess that's when they started tracking trends on search terms. So the search term here was software standards. And I was really curious on, if this is a problem, clearly people must be trying to fight, their own humanity here to stop writing bad code. And apparently in 2004, everyone was really all about it. And then we go forward 12 years and it's kind of tailed off. It's kind of hit an equilibrium in the last decade. And I'm like, that's curious. Why is that? So I figured I'd do another search. And this time, rather than, if you know how trends works, term is just the English language. It only looks for software standards, but they have a topic search. And this crosses all languages and categories and kind of groups it. And the topic in the trends was software quality. And I saw the exact same trend. Now, I'm not a scientist, and it's Google, so this doesn't have any way. I'm not saying everyone here doesn't care about standards. I'm sure people have some sort of standards that they follow, but the point is, I think that this is something that doesn't get talked about a lot. I mean, I don't think standards and best practices is talked about enough. So that's why I'm here, kind of to help solve this problem, or at least bring awareness to bringing standards to your workflow. So I was kind of talking about that scenario earlier about, coming down the 11th hour and having to ship it out. If you know me, this is kind of like a joke. I mean, actually, everyone I work with, we kind of joke about it. We're like, you get something done really quickly, and it's like, story's done, ship it, And there's really great memes that go with it. Memes, excuse me. But this is a mentality that it's easy to fall into, and you joke about it, but it happens. Like, that it really does happen. And the point about having standards and why the ship-it mentality is important is that having standards and best practices can get you to a point where you're not in that 11th hour scenario as often as you would like to be. It's less and less. You're enabling yourself through your own best practices and standards to decrease the amount of times where you're saying, all right, well, we guess we got to ship it. So how can we prevent this? Standards and best practices, I don't think I have to explain that, bring order to something that is inherently entropic. Now, this isn't an original idea I had. This is something I've read through Dave Thomas. And has anyone read The Pragmatic Programmer? Fantastic book. If you haven't, I highly recommend you pick it up. A lot of content I'm going to talk about today is based off of that book. But there's this concept of entropic software in the book. And this is based off of the thermodynamic rule of entropy that you might have learned in your high school physics class about a system of order will inherently break down or degrade into chaos. And I really like that idea because let's say you ship 1.0 of your software and you really think it's great, everything's good, and then more requirements come in, and you couldn't anticipate these requirements, right? So you're going back and looking at code that you were written that met the 1.0 criteria, and you might have to refactor and shimmy, and things might break or not be exactly the way you want to. You got new deadlines, and the code might get messy here and there. Or oftentimes, we're in a situation where you're not even starting from square one. It's not a greenfield project. You're in a situation where you've inherited the code, or you're a new company coming in working on an existing product, and there's been decisions that have made that you've had no bearing on, but you have to live with those decisions. And so you have to make the best decisions you can, and the software, it tends to a state of entropy. So I got a comic up here which I thought was pretty relevant, and it's a child and his or her mother making excuses for why there's a mess all over the place, and saying, you shouldn't teach your child, too early about entropy because, it's a natural law, so it's okay, things fall apart because that's the natural law of the universe. It's all right. How did this happen? Entropy. Oh well. I don't think that's the same. I don't think the business or product owner would really care if you went up and said, well, everything's kind of breaking because entropy. It's all right. That's what you paid for. Really, we are trying to fight software entropy. We are trying to stop the degradation of our code and trying to keep it in order into a more maintainable state. So let's talk a little bit more about software entropy and how that relates to broken windows. The term that was coined by Dave Thomas and Andrew Hunt in the book Pragmatic Programmer is software rot. I personally equate that to technical debt. So all the scenarios I was talking about earlier really boil down to inheriting technical debt or adding to your technical debt that you're going to have to eventually pay later to fix your software and keep it running in the future. And standards and best practices and certain code quality checks can help prevent that. But the one key thing that I really liked was don't leave broken windows. This ties into software entropy in a way that it's a sociological effect amongst society, and it's not just with programming, but it definitely relates to programming. And it was coined by James Wilson and George Kelling, and they wrote an article about this. I guess it was the Atlantic Monthly back in 1982, and it basically dealt with the principle that, in a nutshell, sparing you the whole thesis that they wrote. It boils down to, in a nutshell, is that if you see a broken window, you're less likely to respect or treat something as it should be. And you have no qualms of, well, you know what? If this code's already broken, why does it matter if I write also some more crappy code? And then it snowballs and it continues, and then you end up in this war-torn code base that no one wants to touch anymore because it's a mess. It's the idea that these broken windows, they proliferate. And so in pragmatic programmers, they say, don't leave broken windows, bad designs, wrong decisions, or poor code unrepaired. Fix each one as soon as it is discovered. And if there's insufficient time to fix it properly, then board it up. Make sure it doesn't affect the rest of your code base, kind of the there be dragons here. Or who's ever been in a code base, and I've definitely seen these on the internet where a programmer leaves a nice little comment behind you like, I'm really, really sorry about this, but good luck, future programmer. And I personally haven't stumbled upon one of those. Actually, I take it back. I think there was one code base, certain graphing software. But yeah, it's not fun when you do fall into one of those. But the sociological principle, just to relate the study behind this and how this relates to software, is they took two cars. And I think the one neighborhood they had this car in was the Bronx. And at the time, I think it was in the 80s, it was a high crime rate area. And then they took another car and they left it in Palo Alto, California, typically low crime rate area. And they waited to see what would happen. And with each car, they left like the hood up and they abandoned it and walked away. Within apparently moments in the lower crime neighborhood, the car was immediately vandalized, taken advantage of. And it was quickly within, I think, 48 hours, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, you can look up this story online, that the car became, the wheels were taken and the windows were smashed and it became an issue. It became a derelict. And then the car in Palo Alto, nothing happened to it for a while. And it wasn't until that I think it was Kelling, the one who conducted the study based off Kelling's work was Philip Zimbardo. He went to the car in Palo Alto. He's like, all right, well, I'm going to accelerate the process here. And he took a bat and he smashed the windshield. And then they went back and they observed to see what happened with the car. And sure enough, within a couple hours, people started also vandalizing the car for whatever reason, And here, this was in a low crime neighborhood. You wouldn't typically have expected that. And the car, once again, went through the same process of degradation and entropy that the neighborhood that probably already had some broken windows and had higher crime was susceptible to. So I tell this story because it relates to code, or if you find your code base is in disrepair and you see those broken windows, fix them, because it's going to help prevent issues in the future. And a lot of this comes down to, so how does this all relate to standards, right? That's all good and well in seeing issues in your code. I like to think of standards as the tools to enable you from saving you from yourself and making sure broken windows don't happen in the first place. So a couple things you might also say are, your application really doesn't care if you have standards. It's going to run regardless of how you having good standards, or if you use semicolons, or if you don't use semicolons, or you put your brackets on the left or right. It doesn't care because it's all going to get compiled and interpreted, and it's going to run eventually. Or single and double quotes, or leaving out semicolons. So why do you need standards? Like, your software obviously doesn't care. Sometimes the business doesn't care. They'll say, it runs, I have a product that works. Your coding sensibilities, I don't really care about that. So why? If you can still get something that runs? Well, here's some good reasons why. I like to think that standards prevents entropy and allows for a more efficient team and productive code base. Greater code readability, and like I said before, more importantly, you're thinking about your future developers. And it's not just, ex-employee who might come down the road and inherit that. That future developer, like in my case sometimes, it might be you. And you want to do yourself the service in the future of setting standards around your work. Questions you might ask yourself: what if I work by myself? this is probably, you're probably thinking, standards really relate to when I work in a team or an open source software or organizational type things. If I work by myself, I got, things work for me. I get it done. And I say to you, yeah, that's probably true. Things are fine if you're the only one who's maintaining your code base and you're shipping it off to others. But I imagine if you are a freelancer, are there any freelancers in the room or anyone who works solo? Okay, handful of people, great. You probably don't know it, but you probably have developed your own personal style, and I'll get to that later. There are personal standards that you set forth when you write your code. But sometimes it might be better to inherit something that's more organizational, more global, because then any code you hand off will be understood by the future developer or people who have to work in it on the future. Or maybe you grow and you bring on some employees to your endeavor, and they'll want to understand why you wrote the code the way you did. And you'll save yourself time and money from having that new employee or a new partner having to get ramped up and understand why you wrote things the way you did. It's good to have standards like that. And I guess I should have brought that up earlier, but I think some other great important things about it is those new employees and people who are working for you or whoever you're handing off to, they're going to be able to read your code. They're going to be able to understand it. There's logic onto why you did things the way you did, and it's documented and well known. Once you have your standards documented and they're shareable, whether they're, we're not talking about whether they're good or not or bad or not. It's, that the fact that you have them. So, what if I work alone? I think I skipped a slide. Boop. Sorry about that. That was the slide I was supposed to bring up. Anyways, so relevant XKCD. If you've ever seen this one, the title of it's called Code Quality. I won't read everything out here, but there are some key lines here I thought was pretty funny. Here we have two programmers that are talking with each other, and they're like, oh, cool, let me go check out your code. And it's like, wow, this is like being in a house built by a child using nothing but a hatchet and a picture of a house. It's like a salad recipe written by a corporate lawyer using a phone autocorrect that only knew Excel formulas. And then, more and more and more, it's like, okay, fine, I'll read a style guide, thanks, It's a bad position to be in. Hopefully no one's code's that bad. I mean, this obviously is hyperbole, but what if I work in a team? I think if you work in a team, you absolutely have to have some sort of standards. Whether, it's organizational standards, or let's say you're contributing to WordPress core, there are standards that you have to follow when you contribute to any open source software core. NPM, for example, they have their own set of standards, and they are actually self-identified as the funny standard for the way they do things. Drupal core, they have standards. But most importantly, some reasons I was bringing up earlier, if you're a company and you don't have standards internally, you probably should have some for the ease of onboarding new employees. New programmers can get up to speed very quickly by reading your standards, then going into any code base that you've written and being like, now I know why that decision was made. I understand why they write things the way they do. And it's less training time, and people can get up to speed much quicker and be more efficient on the projects they work in. So I want to talk a little bit about defining your standards. How do you go about doing that? There's a lot of things to pick from, a lot of places you can start. But first I want to talk about, I think I've been interchanging a couple terms here as I talk styles and standards. So I like to think about styles as the pieces, styles or rules, the pieces that make up your standard. So you have a list of rules and styles that then define your standard. Examples of this is like, how you write your comments and where they go. Do you enforce tabs or spaces in your organization or personally? Do you encourage the use of semicolons in your JavaScript, or do you not? Quote usage, say naming conventions for your variables, functions, and methods. And defining certain code patterns that you follow for, hey, maybe writing a module or using Webpack versus Browserify. All of these types of styles and rules contribute to making up the holistic standard that you want to define. So I find that there are kind of 3 tiers of standards that you can find. There's industry standards, organizational standards, and I kind of talk about that the most, and personal standards. Industry standards I like to think of as, say, having like a 3.5 millimeter jack that is common across all devices. That's a pretty common industry standard that people use and know. Another industry standard is, of course, the W3C that controls all standards for the web. JavaScript, I think, and this is highly debatable, so you can talk about me later, but I like to think some of the more global industry standards were first set forth by Douglas Crockford. Has anyone read JavaScript, The Good Parts? If you haven't, I highly recommend you read it. A lot of principles and a lot of standards that folks follow these days were defined by Douglas Crockford and some of his writings and talks. And I think a lot of it he's kind of materialized in JavaScript, The Good Parts. But industry standards, I like to define them as they're widely understood and generally accepted as truth. I think like if you said eval is evil, that's one I typically fall upon. People understood. I hope people understand that the risks of using eval, and Crockford kind of coined eval is evil. Does not say you couldn't use it. Like if you understand what's going on and preventing the use of the wrong usage of it, it's totally fine. But by and large, if you don't know what you're doing, you shouldn't be using it. So industry standards, because there are many varying opinions on that, especially with JavaScript. And it's hard to kind of go in and be like, well, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and rather than starting with my personal standards or organizational standards, I'm going to go ahead and make an industry standard. One, you better be pretty influential in the JavaScript community for that to happen. And also, I love this comic here, another relevant XKCD. Thank you, Randall Monroe, about situation. There's 14 competing standards, and it's like ridiculous. We've got to have one all-encompassing standard, and that sounds great, right? I'd love to have all-encompassing standards. And so all of a sudden now we end up, now we have 15 competing standards. Great. And why does that happen? That's because people have opinions, and it's really hard to find industry standards. It's going to take large corporations typically push those ideas, and so you end up with all these different standards. But I tend to treat industry standards with caution. I think the more relevant layer we get down to is your organizational standards. That's where you can really, drive home. You have a smaller subset of people that you can influence, typically in your own company. Other examples of organizational standards are like I was talking about earlier with, WordPress or open source development. John Papa's Angular guide. I think he's got a style guide also for Angular 2 now as well, which is, I think, considered the de facto style guide. But my point being, there's lots of organizational standards that you can borrow from if you're looking to define your own standards. You don't have to just start with your own personal standards. Hey, start with an organizational standard. If you're going to be doing a lot of node development, learn their standards, make that your own. There's some good things in everyone's standards. And there's a lot of folks out there that have already paved the way for that. Some more examples of organizational standards I already mentioned, NPM, and they said they self-identify as the funny standard, mainly because of their semicolon usage, I think, or lack thereof. Same with standard.js, which is an ESLint configurable plugin that you can install and use. And I'll get more to ESLint later. Standard.js is also something that advocates the absence of semicolons in small minified code, or I guess simplistic, minimalist code. Thank you. And WordPress, of course. Actually, WordPress has their own set of JavaScript standards because it's become a lot more. I'm sure there's a few automatic folks you can talk to about that. And now let's get down to the smallest subset is personal standards. Everyone started out somewhere and they have your own personal standards. If you go back and look at your early code, or if I go back and look at my early code, and if you're in the unfortunate place that I was in when I started writing code, I didn't realize there was syntax highlighting at first because I'm self-taught. I don't know, is anyone else self-taught? Yeah, there's quite a few, it happens. So I started out with Notepad and just plain Windows Notepad, and I guess I hung on to that for a year until I discovered that there was Notepad++, and I was like, oh, things are a lot better here. But because I started out using just Notepad, I developed a lot of quirks in the way I wrote my code, which I don't have anymore, thankfully. But you end up starting with your personal standards, and sometimes you'll find that your personal standards influence the organizational standards. But usually they conflict, and you find yourself having to kind of follow your organizational standards. Like if you go work at a company, they probably have a set way of doing things, and they want you to work in that way so everyone understands for the reasons I stated above. But prepare for a spirited debate if you'd like to push your standards onto the organization and make a change. By all means, I encourage you to do that. I mean, that's how things evolve, right? We can't just always stick with one thing and that's it for all the rest of the time. Things evolve. So I want to talk a little bit about tools for success that help enable and enforce your standards that you've already come up with or you've yet to come up with. I think a big portion of this is linting. Linting, this term kind of derives from like the bits and fiber and fluff that comes out in the laundry. You got your lint catcher. So it's like throwing your code in the dryer and like, oh, here's all the crap and I can throw it away. The idea behind linter is it'll syntactically check your static code and find errors in it. It's like, say you're missing a semicolon, say you are trying to define a function inside an if conditional block. Linters like JSLint, JSHint, ESLint, there's a lot of them now, do that. And comment in your code. There's two ideas to this, and I'll get into that more. And also, it was mentioned actually in the last talk, the dry methodology. Dry methodology, also something that was coined in the Pragmatic Programmer by Dave Thomas. I think so. You can correct me on that on Twitter later. But I'm pretty sure he's the one who coined that back in the 80s. And I'll get into that more too. So what are linters? Like I said before, they are things that check your code for issues. So the first one I know of for JavaScript was created by Douglas Crockford. And the way he kind of described JSLint was it's going to make you upset. And at the time when he made it, what was it, 2002? That was a long time ago. JavaScript was in a different place. There were way different browsers. I don't think browser wars had really been settled yet. I think Firefox was just coming out into 1.0. There was a lot of different ways to write JavaScript, mainly because of the browser wars and Microsoft and their own implementation of JavaScript. So Douglas Crockford said to himself, I'm going to write a linter the way other programming languages do to make sure that everyone is writing JavaScript in a clean, efficient way the way I see it. And it was really great at first, and people really liked it. He didn't make it configurable, though, from what I understand. So folks were like, I actually don't want to check for semicolons, or I don't want to check for tabs. I want to just have it check everything else, but not that. But it wasn't really written in a way to handle that. So let's fast forward to 2010, and we have a gentleman named Anton Gavuliev. I probably butchered that name. I'm sorry, Anton. And he forked the original code from Douglas Crockford. And Douglas Crockford actually worked with him, and they put together, and they aren't the only ones who contributed this. There's a lot of people who have contributed to JSHint, and that came out around 2010. So I think that was a big hit when that came out. JSHint was configurable. You could pass in a configuration inside your package JSON if you're a Node developer. You could just have a regular JSHint RC file sitting in the root of your project. It was great. Now I could turn off the rules that I really don't care about and just check the certain things I want. Getting closer to, rather than inheriting an industry standard, and now being able to craft your own organizational standard or personal standard through configuration and enforcing that through a linter. And then we fast forward here to 2013 and ESLint came out. I have to say it's probably the most popular linter to date right now and is used in a lot of projects. I know we use it at Think Brownstone. But ESLint is open source JavaScript, and that came out in 2013. So I did some more scientific studies, and I ran to Google, and I actually confirmed that ESLint is the most popular linter now. So if you're in the market, I'm sure everyone's heard of ESLint. You can go ahead and get it. The great thing, if you haven't, does everyone use linters of some sort? Yeah. I know it's probably a given here at a JavaScript conference, but I thought I'd bring it up because it is relevant to enforcing your code. So this is Atom. This is taken from the linter plugin on their page. It's just an animated GIF. The kind of thing where, for this instance, I think it's pulling out that this gentleman has missing a semicolon. And of course, it alerts you to it. Really great tool. The other thing I really like about ESLint is that it's configurable and you can do shared configs. I might be wrong, maybe JSLint has shared configs now, but I know ESLint does it through the node package management system, where if you want to share your organizational standards through ESLint, you can create a package, and then all you're doing is defining that in your package JSON, and a simple npm update updates all the standards for all of your programmers and people who are working with you. I think it's a fantastic way to enforce organizational standards rather than making sure the same JS-hint RC or same configuration files making it through each project, either through like a Git submodule or just making sure it's copied over. Package management, I think, is definitely a better way to go here. So I mentioned commenting earlier and how there's kind of two trains of thoughts on this. This is Jeff Atwood, and this is one of his quotes. And if you notice the typo in the first line, though, it says "if your feel your code." I left that in place because that is on his blog, and it's his own typo. And I just wanted to quote him accurately, so that's not my own typo. But Jeff Atwood, he's the creator of, he's got his own blog, Coding Horror, and I think he's also one of the co-creators of Stack Overflow, which I'm sure everyone's used at one point in here. And he says, if you feel your code is too complex to understand without comments, your code is probably just bad. Rewrite it until it doesn't need comments anymore. If at the end of the efforts you still feel comments are necessary, then by all means, add comments carefully. And I think this is really important. And the reason for that is that if you are adhering to a set of standards and your code is readable because of those standards, you aren't going to need as many comments in your code to make it understood. Now, if you're using something like JSDoc or YUIDoc to document an API or automatically document stuff, then you probably have to get pretty verbose with your comments. And that's totally fine, because that's a standard in itself. There are conventions you have to follow when you use JSDoc or YUIDoc. But if you're in a point where you're writing War and Peace in your code comments, you probably should take a second look and be like, so why am I adding so many comments? I mean, he had a good point here, I feel like, that if I'm adding that many comments, maybe I did something a bit wrong. So. And here we go, is dry. Don't repeat yourself. I think this is a pretty well-known concept as far as not repeating yourself. And this isn't simply just making sure you don't repeat yourself in your code and having methods that do the same thing in different components or modules. I think dry is much bigger than that. Standards are in themselves enforcing not repeating yourself. You're trying to inhibit those bad habits that would come with doing a wet type implementation. In documenting those things in a standard allows you to not repeat yourself. You can go back and be like, well, why did we do it this way before? That's right, we looked in the standards. It's documented there. It's documented in one source of truth. It's not repeated in multiple sources of truth. It's one place there. And this proliferates across our code bases. So, I mean, as is with anything, when you're writing code, you should try to strive towards a dry implementation. But also having standards and enforcing them lends itself well and sets you up for success for having a dry implementation. So now that we've talked about the many different things and styles, it comes down to you needing to pick a style. Designing a programming style demands discipline. It is not selecting features because they are liked or pretty or familiar. And Douglas Crawford said this in one of his talks, and he followed up with saying, there's different reasons why you're going to pick certain styles, and it's not because, oh, well, everyone really feels this is really great. You really need to figure out what's working with your organization and how you are writing your code that's going to work for everyone. And don't get hung up on the nitty-gritty. There was one talk that Douglas Crawford gave that he relayed a story about, I think it was the R programming language, and the creators, they didn't really specify how your brackets kind of line up in the language. And I think it was Bell Labs that the programmers there were debating, saying, well, we should have brackets on the left, and no, we really need to have brackets on the right. And there was big meetings and debates about this, and like, well, we'll just pull in the creators of the language. They'll tell us how it was supposed to be, and they'll show everyone what it was supposed to be. And the creators are like, we really don't care. It's a dumb thing to argue about. Whatever works for you. Just make it happen. You're wasting time. some languages it does matter how those brackets line up. I'm not going to go into that now, but as long as the point being, as long as the standards make sense to you, and they're going to work for your personal standards or your organizational standards, you should don't let the small stuff bother you. I mean, as I was just saying, yeah, don't sweat the small stuff. I mean, I think in JavaScript there's debates on how you should use semicolons or single quotes or double quotes or, of course, the eval, when you should use it, and as long as you know what you're doing. The point is, as long as you understand why you've chosen those standards and you're consistent in your implementation, you'll be setting yourself up for success. If anyone see the show Silicon Valley, this is a really, I really like this scene. The main character here has finally gotten a girlfriend of some sorts, and Gilfroy and his employees tell her that he's really hung up on tabs versus spaces. It's a big deal to him, and he's trying to nonchalantly shrug off how he doesn't really care. He got a preference for tabs, but spaces drive him nuts. But I'm not here to dig up that debate. We can talk about it after. I do prefer tabs. Yeah. Be consistent when you enforce those standards, and if you're going to change them, make sure you're consistent in changing them throughout your code base. There's this concept of the abyss, and that's what Douglas Crockford coined as it's a state of having no standards, and in his word, it is a very cold, dark, and soulless place, and shame on you for not having standards, but so you should, so you don't end up in the abyss. So what can we do? If your organization doesn't have standards, go create some standards. If you don't have any personal standards, go create some standards. And you're like, I already have standards, dude. Stop preaching to me. Great, now follow your standards. So one caveat, we're still human. This ties back to what I said earlier. You're still going to write bad code, sorry. You will one day, on accident or on purpose. But at least you're now enabled to have some standards that are going to fight that. So it won't solve all your problems, but hopefully some of them it will. So define your standards and stick to them. Any questions?
Do you have any recommendations for helping teams create standards, particularly where there may already exist some differing opinions?
Sure, absolutely. I can speak to experience. I know, I think Brownstone, we kind of looked at some existing organizational standards out there and found what worked for the team, and it was kind of a diplomatic or democratic process, I should say, excuse me. We looked at how we write our code now, what started out writing some goals of what we wanted to achieve with these standards, and then kind of worked through existing standards. Say, I think most notably we looked at different CSS type standards like BEMS and stuff like that. We looked at different JavaScript organizations that I think we looked at Airbnb as a starting point. And if someone's, there's no shame. If someone's really got a good standard put together and you like that, but there's some tweaks you want to make to it, there's a reason they're out there publicly and it's open source. You can look at that, start there as a starting point, drill down to what you need, talk with your team about it, and you can go from there. Does that make sense? Cool. Yes?
I know this is a JavaScript conference, but are there linters for CSS, and should we use them?
There are linters for CSS, and there's also linters for HTML. I have no problem with you using those, and I hear they work quite well. There's even things for CSS called CSS comb. Some folks are really particular on the order of their their CSS properties and rules that will automatically, read your CSS and reorder all the rules to the way that you've defined. So yes, there are linters and things that are reordered. So yeah, thanks for asking that.
You talk about having to find a balance, and people assume on the spec that you ever have a problem with people being so pedantic about standards that when they inherit a project, they say, well, this is wrong. I will redo the entire thing to make it fit my standard. When sometimes you just need to go in and tweak it a little bit to keep it running. Like, is there a place to say, let's refactor this on purpose in the future?
I think you have to do a cost-benefit analysis at that point, really, with what you're trying to achieve. And I'm assuming this particular individual, this is their own personal style they'd like to. That's why I kind of had the personal standards. They have to take backseat to what the organization and the greater good needs. So there's greater weight in that. If you have organizational standards, you can at least say, listen, this is the way we write our code here. I understand you have your own personal predilections to how things need to be written, but we'll follow these standards here. So, and having them documented is the first step there. Any other questions? Yes, Tom. Yeah.
Are there any recommendations on using like the new ES6, creating standards for that?
Yeah, I think that's why ESLint really is coming to popularity. It has a whole, and JSHint does as well. It has a whole host of linting rules for looking at ES 2015 or ES6, whatever you want to call it, that will help enforce common issues with that, and it's all configurable, of course. So yeah. Any other questions? Cool. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it.